This is the Gateway API meeting for February 24. We've got a few things to cover today, but I think it'll be relatively light. I'm excited to hear what Mark has to say about what we're doing in GKE for Gateway implementation. Mark, do you have anything that you need to screen share? Oh, sorry, I can't. I don't know. Did you say something, Mark? I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was just joining the meeting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no problem. Are you able to talk about what we're doing in GKE for Gateway?
Yeah, I can. So let me try and share my
Awesome.
screen. I just had some issues with my computer, so let me see if I can share my phone screen. Oh, it says that only the host can share.
Oh, 1 second. Let me fix that. All right, you should be able to share away.
Okay. I think you can. Can you see? Can you see my screen now?
I don't.
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, let me try one more time.
That looks
Okay,
promising.
okay, all right. And can you see the doc?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so the scope of this controller, so we're calling it the Gke Gateway Controller, and the scope of it is to manage the load balancers that are used in GCP for GKE. So we have a lot of load balancers, probably more than we should have. We have an external global load balancer, layer 7. We have an internal layer 7 that's a regional one. We also have corresponding external and internal layer 4 load balancers. And underneath the hood, they actually have all different. Did my screen sharing go away?
It got stuck halfway as you were transitioning into the dock. We're just kind of frozen as we
Yeah,
can
it
see
was
half of the dock.
stuck between your screen share and your Zoom.
Yeah.
Bummer. Okay. Rob, can you share this portion of the?
Yeah, just message me the link and I'll get in to it.
Okay, so I'll just continue talking through it, but we'll have several gateway classes, and roughly speaking, a gateway class will correspond to the underlying implementation. And we went through a kind of a lot of discussions about, do we want to have more abstract gateway classes that interprets kind of what the user wants to do, or do we want to have gateway classes that correspond more to the underlying implementation? And we found that it was probably better to have it correspond to the underlying implementation, primarily because it makes the usage, it has the least surprises for the user. And one really clear example of this is in how different ports are supported for the load balancers. Like for instance, the external load balancer supports port 80, 443, and 80. The internal load balancer, I think, supports a different set of ports. And so we wanted the ability to have our documentation be that if you use a certain gateway class, it tells you exactly what is supported and which fields are supported for every resource in the tree for gateway. So for instance, our external load balancer does not support weights. And so that's a field. If we use separate gateway classes for all these load balancers, it's very easy to document to say, if you're using the layer 7 XLB gateway class, weights are not supported in your route. And so that's kind of our thinking behind our usage of gateway classes. It's really used to kind of communicate the behavior of the underlying implementation in an explicit way that's predictable for users.
Sounds good.
So I'll talk any questions on that? I can talk a little bit about the actual implementation. So the implementation is based on Borg hosted or Google hosted controllers. So we used to have, for our current ingress controller actually runs inside the cluster. And instead of running it inside the cluster, it was much easier for our development and just for developer velocity to run them as Google hosted. So they're watching the resources inside the cluster, but they're hosted outside of the cluster. And so the controller actually will pre-install the gateway classes. So we have some gateway classes. We have some gateway classes that are going to be pre-installed, and so these will be CRDs that always exist in the cluster. And so if the customer basically goes to their cluster, they'll see that the gateway classes exist, and they can use them for different purposes. We've talked about the ability to use or to create your own gateway class, and we're not sure whether customers will want to do this or not, but that's something that we're looking to probably make possible as well. So you could effectively, if you want to use a different name or maybe have a consistent name for your gateway class that exists across all your environments, you could effectively recreate one of our gateway classes using your own name.
Hey, sorry for the delay there, Mark. I finally got screen sharing to hopefully work here. I'm highlighting right now this is still internal doc and I think most of this is fairly internal information, but coming out to be more public pretty soon. Mark, is there a specific part that we should highlight here? Go ahead.
I was just highlighting the gateway classes. To be honest, most of the user guide is really just referencing our public docs, and so most of it is probably pretty much the same across other implementations as well. So I think that really most of the custom portions of the user guide are really just around which fields are supported and which are not, because our load balancing implementations kind of have different things that they do.
Yeah, I think one thing that I think is worth pointing out, a bit of our uniqueness here is if you look at our gateway classes here, the load balancers that are behind them. One of our kind of unique challenges with the API is we can't, I guess this isn't necessarily unique, but we can't provide a gateway that provides both TCP and HTTP. Like we can't do L7 and L4 in the same gateway kind of thing, which I think will be fairly common, but this is just, more obvious as you start to look at what our gateway classes are going to map to. Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure, and maybe if, even in Google Cloud, I don't think it's possible right now for a layer 7, layer 4 load balancer to share the same IP. If it were possible, we may still want to have separate gateway classes and maybe gateways that share the same IP, just because, at least the way we've been using gateway classes so far, they're kind of just used as something to make the behavior of the API explicit. And so because the layer 4 load balancing functions, implementation is very different from layer 7, that we would still want to make that explicit to users. But we haven't done any work on layer 4 yet, so there's not much to show there yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm not sure if you already covered this, but one of the things that we've been trying to figure out as part of this is how we'll handle the gateway CRDs. like how we'll actually install these our API, the Gateway API, and GK clusters. If I'm remembering correctly right now, that's something that will be, this feature will either be opt-in or something like that can be disabled. Do you remember where we landed on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think it'll probably be an opt-in at the cluster level. And so there'll be one flag that's kind of like enable Gke Gateway Controller. And then, so that enables it for the cluster, and then that'll trigger the installation of the CRD, and also the installation of the 2 gateway classes we have.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, if the user deletes a gateway class, it'll just get reinstalled. And then the way we were planning on using the parameters file is basically the parameters file holds every dimension that defines a gateway class. And they're kind of just the dimensions of the load balancer, like internal, external, layer 7, layer 4, global, regional. Those are kind of the dimensions that determine what the load balancers are. And so those will probably be in the parameters field. So if a customer wanted to create their own gateway class with using those parameters, they could. To be honest, we have not spent much time talking to users about this and whether they find that valuable. So that's kind of conjecture.
That makes sense.
Cool. And that's all I want to share. And if there's any
Yeah.
questions or any specifics. All right.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing. Actually, I'm realizing that I need to stop sharing my screen or my other screen. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely interested for others that maybe haven't been, that have been working on other implementations of this API. If you're doing anything different, or if you want to share in a future meeting what you're thinking, how you're thinking of implementing this API, I found it really helpful. Last week looking at what Istio, what Contour are doing with the API. It's been helpful to see how others are interpreting this API and trying to turn it into a real implementation. And I imagine everyone's going to have slightly different interpretations of some parts. So it'd be good to get that out early and make sure that we can come to some kind of common ground. I'm curious for anyone that was looking at that, did anything seem strange or unexpected or different than how you're doing it? Obviously, this is going to be somewhat different, but
Not particularly strange. Still got a ways to go before I'm ready to have real input personally, but I expect in the coming weeks to have real input and something to show.
okay.
So
great.
I'm mostly just in the I'm listening, I'm looking and learning kind of phase.
Yeah, that's great. Glad to have you. And I should say, like, I think one of the things that we're still not completely sure about is we're trying to figure out how, and I think this is true of the project as a whole, we're trying to figure out how these APIs are going to be installed and how we're going to avoid kind of how we're going to all play nicely together in the same cluster. Basically, let's say we have one cluster that has 4 different gateway implementations. How do we make sure CRDs exist and they exist at a version that all the different implementations support? And anyway, so that's
this also goes to the release process because we have decoupled from Kubernetes versioning. But as people have more real implementations, and then eventually, what is the support model, or at some point do we couple to Kubernetes or not?
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
You have the same thing with ingress controllers, right? I mean, it's the same situation with the ingress and ingress class resources, dealing with multiple implementations.
Yeah, I think the big difference is that Ingress API is core, so we're adding one extra layer of confusion here, at least for now. And that gives us a lot of flexibility. It means we can iterate more quickly outside of Kubernetes release cycle and also support versions back to 1.16. Whereas if we were releasing these APIs in Kubernetes, we'd be tied to, say, 122, or I don't know, some core version that would limit the availability of the APIs initially. But that does mean that we're going to have this weird issue, at least as we start, where one control, do users install these CRDs? Are users responsible for installing the API, or does it come bundled with implementations? And we just do that bundling in a way that it makes sure not to clobber some other version of the API if it's already installed. I don't think there's a good question from Bowie in chat. I don't think we have an issue tracking this yet, but I think this deserves more discussion and a tracking issue. Because this is something that's going to be relevant to everyone's installation process. And I think what we've seen so far from the early implementations is just install these CRDs and install our controller and everything will work. And that is absolutely true. But as we start to get more and more implementations of this, and it becomes more common for multiple implementations to exist in the same cluster, and potentially different versions of the API to coexist, we need to make sure that we have a good story around this. And maybe that story eventually becomes that these APIs transition into core Kubernetes. I'm not sure. But between now and then, we need to figure out what that looks like. It may also not end up being a big deal. We may have limited API versions that all interact well with each other, and we're fine. But just want to make sure that we're thinking about that early in this process.
Is it viable to say it's a single implementation per cluster until we're ready to put it in upstream core?
I think, unfortunately, that would be hard because a lot of people will be on cloud providers, which will provide their own implementation, and then installing, they can also install stuff. So it's kind of overly hostile, I guess. In fact, Ingress, the whole class mechanism was to actually allow like N providers into a given cluster.
So not really feasible.
Yeah, we could say it won't work, but people will do it anyways, and they'll complain to us.
So just another day in software?
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think initially what we're going to see is a lot of that kind of everyone's using a single implementation in their clusters, but inevitably there's going to be someone somewhere that tries more implementations. They want to compare. How does this implementation work versus that implementation? And if we're not prepared for that, we'll be in a bad place. Okay, well, I'll follow up with this and make sure that there's some kind of issue to track this discussion. I think it's definitely worth a bit more discussion, especially as others are starting to get closer to releasing implementations. I think it's a lot more likely that we'll have multiple implementations per cluster relatively soon.
Sounds good. That's definitely something I'll subscribe to.
Cool. Okay, cool. All I had left, oh yeah, so I did add a little note here for the previewing changes with Netlify. A lot of reviewers are on this call, and it's a little bit less obvious now. So I wanted to so basically before, if there was a docs change, in the diff, you would see the actual HTML that was changing. And if you paid enough attention to the HTML, you could notice things that were completely off. Now that we've pulled out the compiled docs from Git, it means that we don't see those changes directly here. I think that's a net positive, but it means you have to dig into the pre-submits here and take a look at this deploy Netlify link. So if you click on details here.
Rob, are you
this-
presenting your screen?
I was trying and maybe it's not working. Cool, let me try again. Any luck? Still blank? Anybody?
Yeah, it's still loading for me. Before we were just seeing the Google Doc.
Oh, weird. Okay. Cool. Black rectangle. All right. Well, anyone
Don't use
else?
a 4K monitor, Rob.
I guess that's it. How did you know? No, I don't know what. It seems like every other day I have an issue with this. Any volunteers to share a screen real quick?
I can try.
Harry, you're the best. Thank you for always taking care of my technical difficulties.
No problem. Can you let me screen share? I think you need.
Oh yeah. One second. By the time this meeting is over, everyone's going to be a co-host.
Okay, you are the co-host now. Screen share. All right. Which link do I share now? Docs and
Yeah, that's actually perfect. Any PR, it doesn't matter. If you just go to one of the more recent PRs. Yeah, I was just trying to highlight that it's not obvious here, the diff in docs, but yeah, if you go down to deploy Netlify and click on details, you get a very fun preview of what the docs will look like based on that PR. I don't think that PR changes much in docs. I just wanted to highlight that this should be a part of every review process going forward if it changes any markdown, because otherwise it could get missed easily. Yeah,
makes sense. I guess we will miss
Cool.
a lot of these things now.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully this is better, but it does mean that we're missing the compiled HTML diff, which means a lot less conflicts, but it is, yeah.
It's net positive, I think.
Yeah.
So I agree.
Cool. All right. And then the rest I had was just a bit of PR and issue triage. There's a couple of new PRs up that I think we've looked at briefly. But yeah, Harry, do you want to click through just some of these? I think this one is probably the least controversial thing out there.
I just put in controversial statement in there.
Oh yeah.
Sure. So this PR does is let me open the diff view. Sorry, Doc, I'm stealing it from you. So what this does is forget. Okay, so these examples are good. So what we have here is we have core API. Some of our examples had group as core, but if you look at kubectl API resources or other parts of Kubernetes, I think the group is left as empty for core APIs like service or pod or some things like that. So here, the right way to do, I think the proposed way is that we specify an empty string instead of core. We cannot do that because we have a validation here of minimum length pod. So that's why this PR makes a lot of sense. One thing that I did notice was this is optional. So rather than specifying an empty string, why can't the user ignore it? I guess one answer is that it's less intuitive, right? The user would want to put in an empty string. So,
I think
yeah, does that
that also highlights a relatively unique thing of what we're trying to do here. And that is we're trying to have a default that is not core, which is not common. It looks like in the rest of Kubernetes resources. So maybe we should reconsider that. I'm not sure here, but this does highlight that using a default of networking group would mean that empty string for core and networking being the default would be difficult to distinguish because an empty string would be transitioned to this default as I'm understanding it right now. Anyone who's more familiar with defaulting can correct me, but that's my understanding. So we could transition group to a pointer here, but even that feels a little weird.
Is this overall an attempt to separate core versus extended versus implementation specific?
No, I think this. So the other. So this is not core in that sense. This is meant to be a reference to core v1, like secret ref or config map ref or all those other, or service, I guess would be the most common one for this API. And so far we've required that group to be referred to as core instead of what you've seen in upstream and elsewhere as just empty string. And if we allow empty string to map to core group, which is common everywhere else, it means that our default in this one case to our own networking group would not work well or could be confusing.
Okay, so it's core of gateway types versus core of Kubernetes.
Right, and I think this PR is suggesting that empty string should point to core Kubernetes, and that makes sense in most cases, except for this one case where we want to default to reference our own, like this API type, this API group by default. And having those two defaults be different is confusing. If in some places, if I don't specify group, I get core, and if in other places I get, and networking core. Well, whatever we want to call our own gateway API group here.
Rob, are you suggesting that we should default to one overall across everything?
No, not necessarily. What I'm saying is CRD defaulting is limited right now in the sense that if you're not using a pointer type, empty string is considered empty. And so it's going to apply any default value that you have. So if we say the default value for this reference, which in this case would be a route reference, is our networking group, that makes sense, but it means that if empty string is the way you reference core Kubernetes group, there's no way to do that because a default is always going to clobber that. I don't know, does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me.
And the worst part is I think that default actually makes sense there. Like we do want a default. So maybe your suggestion here, Harry, of maybe group in this one case should be a pointer. So we can enable that distinction between empty string and no value at all. That would allow someone to specify empty string for group and have that reference core. It's just a little bit inconsistent. That's all. Because group in most places is not going to be a pointer.
It also feels a little icky from a user
Yeah.
experience point of view, right?
Yeah.
I think let's go back and think a little more.
Okay.
I think we can come to an agreement on this call.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right.
Anybody has any other comments on this? Okay. Another pointer. The path field is set to HTTP route is defined by another.
Yeah, I found this PR really interesting, and it shows kind of a gap in our testing. Everything I've tested so far has been really focused on using kubectl and applying YAML, and defaulting works there as I expected. But if I'm remembering this PR correctly, it's trying to fix an issue where defaulting with the Go client library does not work as expected. So if they don't specify it, they get an error. Wait, did I misread that? Can you go to the beginning of that error message? Sorry, just yeah.
Just creating ingress.
Right. Okay. Oh, okay. This has got to be a Knative specific thing, because then it does point to HTTP route.
Yeah, I think their use cases, they often like do a blank thing and then eventually update it later. That might be why they're running into this.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so this seems to indicate that at least for, and the issue, as I understand it, is the field we're using here. If you can go back to the PR, the field we're using here is not a pointer, but we are trying to apply a default. And so when you're using Go client library, I'm assuming that it's harder to differentiate between an empty value. And so it just thinks that the user tried to specify HTTP path match here. And so if we change this to a pointer, it would help in that case.
But isn't this error a little different? Dot rules with match with path. It is not related. Oh, this is because.
Yeah, it's sending an empty struct up, basically. And the PR just changes that to a pointer. Damien, you seem to you have a lot of knowledge or context on pointer versus non-pointer decisions here. Does this seem like a reasonable change to you? Should we be using pointers more broadly for these, anywhere we're trying to apply a default like this?
Yeah, so since this is optional, if it's optional, should have the omit and empty JSON tag, should be a pointer. When the type is a custom type like HTTP path match, that's where there's some ambiguity with the upstream recommendations.
Yeah, but there's nothing in upstream that clearly says we should or should not have a pointer here, as I recall, right? It's just, yeah. So
I may be
in
wrong,
this,
but I thought that there was, like, optionals are supposed to be pointers according to the API docs.
It
Yeah,
is. They kind of get into the details related to the types. So, if it's if it's a map or a slice and it doesn't need a pointer, and I don't think it really addresses custom types. So again, there's just some ambiguity with the upstream recommendations. And if you look at some of the upstream code, you'll see both options where there's pointers for custom types and there's not, even though it's optional and the omit empty tag exists.
Rules are made to be broken.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
So I think
yeah,
for us, sorry, Rob, I think for us, I think it just comes down to the consistency. So to avoid confusion.
Yeah, as much as pointers are a pain to work with, it does seem like this is a pretty compelling case where we should be using pointers. If I'm remembering the API conventions correctly, it's exactly what you said, Danny, and it's very clear that Go values, Go types that have easy to distinguish empty value do not need to be pointer types like maps and slices, but it's much less clear for these custom types, these structs, whatever. I would lean towards, as I'm remembering this a bit more, I think the absence of them excluding or adding an exception for structs makes me think that we probably should be using pointers here.
Well, part of the challenge too is the upstream recommendations don't take into account defaulting. And so you look at this change and it's like, well, why is this change really even necessary? Because there's always going to be, if this is, if the path is undefined, it's always going to be defaulted to prefix and value of the slash. And so I just don't understand why this would really need to be a pointer.
Well, right, and it gets defaulted for using YAML, apply, kubectl, etc., but it does not appear to be defaulted when using client Go for whatever reason.
Mm.
And it seems like, and this is a theory that I have not personally tested, but it seems like switching this to a pointer type resolves the client Go issue as well.
So with client Go, you create a route that doesn't specify path, and it doesn't get defaulted to prefix slash.
Harry, can you go back to the issue with this? I think the error message is somewhat helpful in showing what's getting sent up. Yeah, it's sending up an empty path match despite the Go above clearly not specifying anything there. Yeah, I think to me, I'm increasingly convinced that this is the right direction and one we should apply more broadly. But I know we have struggled to get the right balance of pointers and not here, so need to be careful with any direction we go. But I think that the absence of an exclusion here for structs makes me think that we should be using pointers here as well.
Well, in this example too, I'd be curious to see if it errors out if the HTTP header matches is undefined as opposed to defining the type and the values there. But yeah,
I think this is just kind of what they do for. So they'll create all these things like the wiring, and then update them as needed. So if a request comes in, then they trigger an update and fill all these in because they're using those headers to dictate their routes and everything via like Istio or something.
Oh, interesting. Cool. I can follow up on this one, but definitely appreciate any additional thoughts on this one. If there's a reason we shouldn't go forward, but I think it is probably the right direction.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I just don't know. I mean, it's the API server doing the defaulting, and whether you're using kubectl or the Go client, I just don't understand why this error is being hit just specifically with the Go client. Something seems odd.
Yeah.
And maybe, turning that field into a pointer solves a problem, but, I don't know. I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, you're right.
What was that?
Time for somebody to break out Delve and dig in.
Yeah.
Yeah, just try to reproduce it. Again, I mean, if I reproduce it, the next thing I would do is just trying to create an empty HTTP header match, because I don't think it gets defaulted when you're actually putting the type and value there. That bypasses the defaulting, but you have to just try to replicate it.
I think it goes through the Go types, right? The YAML from kubectl apply does not go through those Go types, and this goes through it, right? So even though you have omit empty on the struct, the JSON or YAML or whatever marshaller that is being used, sorry, right here. If you don't have a pointer, it will always inject it, right? Omit empty for a struct makes no sense. It only makes a sense for a pointer to a struct. So it always injects that in the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, if we change it here, I would just suggest that you kind of audit the rest of the fields, right? I mean, if we truly believe this is an issue as described in that last screen that we saw, I think we should understand and verify it. And if that is the case, probably go back, because I mean, this is kind of a pattern that is being used elsewhere other than, I believe it's being used elsewhere other than just the HTTP path match, right? So
yeah,
if you don't audit the rest of the area, then it's just a matter of time that a similar issue arises. Again, I still question if it's an issue or not, but maybe we should audit the rest of the fields if it's going to be changed here.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I know that we're using this pattern elsewhere, and we need a pretty clear reproduction comparing what happens with a kubectl apply path versus a client go path, and understanding how changing to a pointer type helps there. I do think changing to a pointer type makes sense, but we should do it. If we do it, we should do it consistently. across all struct types like this that are optional. Cool. All right, I can follow up with that unless someone else wants to, but I don't know that I'll have time to reproduce this soon, but I think that is the next step to compare the two. Yeah, I wanted to, I guess we had covered, yeah, let's go through this one. Mark, you added, I don't know, is Mark still on the call? No, it looks like he had to drop. I wanted to revisit this PR because it is a relatively significant, this isn't a PR, this is an issue, but it's a relatively significant change. And I wanted to run this by everyone and see how we felt. The proposal here is that route selector should not be optional, and the empty behavior should not be to select everything. Basically, you need to specify some kind of match, and if you don't, nothing will be matched. The concern that Mark was raising here is that our current kind of, select everything by default behavior can lead to overexposure of routes among gateways. So if you create a gateway just by default in a namespace, it's exposing all routes in that namespace, which is amazing for our simplest use cases, but becomes I hate to say a vulnerability, but a concern among larger clusters, larger namespaces, etc., where you really probably don't want that to be your default behavior.
Yeah, we should be very careful about making examples look pretty, and then any real deployment kind of is like doesn't use the examples.
Yeah, and I think the empty selector selecting everything is technically the appropriate action for a selector, but it is probably not desirable here. And we've already seen kind of the prior art with a empty selector on service. That definitely doesn't select everything, even though a selector technically should. So I think we have enough precedent with what service is already doing that we could do the same kind of approach here, where empty service selector basically allows you to define your own endpoints. I think, or another interpretation is it doesn't select anything by default. I think it would be reasonable to parallel that approach to our API. This is a pretty significant change, so I wanted to, I think I may have brought this up once before, but I just wanted to bring it back up to see if it's something like that seems like a reasonable change.
Yeah, I think so. The case being makes sense here. One question I had was, how would we do the easy path in that case? Like, is there a way to specify like select all, like explicitly in a selector?
No, I mean, technically that is empty selector. But I think our easy case would have to evolve in that case and always have a selector and always have labels on the route, which I think leads to much easier expansion in the future. Like if somebody starts with those selectors already in place, it allows them to create another gateway without worrying, and another set of routes without worrying that they're going to be selected by your other gateway. So I think that sets people up better for success, even if it does it does make our simple example less simple. It requires labels on both the route and the gateway selector. but at the expense of a simple example. It makes this more robust and better able to handle expansion and more gateways in the same namespace in the future.
Yeah, so one thing that I recall now is in the past we had discussed this, and I think the point made then was that the default for namespaces is same namespace. So if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, that's what Mark has also written, right? So it selects all the routes from that specific namespace. Is that also a bit too permissive? Probably. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I know I'd argued against that wasn't too permissive before, but I think I'm coming around to the idea that it probably is. And seeing the challenges that other APIs have had by starting with a too permissive defaults, less secure defaults, it's very hard to make your defaults more secure over time. And so I'd hate to make that mistake again.
Yeah, that's true. And this is coming from testing feedback. So it would be great if some of the other implementations, when they talk to their customers as well, kind of add to this. My take is that this probably makes sense, but it makes our examples more verbose, because of the customers that I know of, like all of them kind of deploy and are very specific, versus sort of like a dev kind of creating stuff on their own, in which case the select all is a bit easier, but it's like less underspecified almost.
So I think one thing that I'm realizing here is that we're not actually making a significant API change as much as we're making a change to how the API is interpreted. We can't prevent someone from specifying an empty selector very easily. Anyway, we could potentially with a webhook, but there's still potential for someone to specify an empty selector. I think what we want to suggest here is that an empty selector, instead of selecting everything, should select nothing.
Oh, this is a label selector? What if we defaulted it to nil? I guess there's no way to do that.
I mean, you could do a pointer, and yeah, so that's the fun thing. You can do a pointer, and the nil value of a selector is select nothing. The empty value.
It seems like what we're basically saying.
It does, but I really hate that, because the difference between nil and empty is just worlds apart. Like nil means nothing, empty means everything, and it's not obvious always to understand the difference, especially if you're just looking at some YAML.
Yeah, the other hand is that you're right, there are other examples where we kind of violated this. It's just that the label selector documentation will say one thing, and then this will say another thing. I don't know where that falls.
Yeah, I think if we didn't have the prior art from service, this would be a hard sell. But because service already is doing the same thing, and this feels very similar in concept to what service is doing, it feels reasonable to treat it in a similar way.
Should we just send a ping to APM machinery, or just to say, hey, this thing already exists in service and we're going to keep extending it? And if there's some big, like, no, don't do that, that was a mistake. Or just like, oh, whatever, you can go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I can send something like out to the mailing list there.
We are basically propagating something that may have been inadvertent.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine many of the original things with service were not ideal necessarily. And we are trying to fix some of those problems. So to propagate them further may not be ideal. Just need to make sure. All right. Well, I know we're basically at time here. I think I added one other issue to the list, but there's plenty of other ones open. The docs improvements one from Mark is one that if anyone happens to have some extra cycles, this would be an amazing way to contribute. There are, I think, 6 action items here that are all on their own relatively straightforward, or many of them are. So if you're looking for a kind of way to get a contribution or 2 in that I think might be relatively straightforward, this would be a great way to contribute. So
I'd be happy to take a look at that.
Awesome.
Rob,
Thank
I
you.
just posted, like, this is actually worthwhile pinging on Slack because we have 260 people hanging out there. I haven't used that as a channel for soliciting contributions, but it seems like a decent way to get some visibility.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. But yeah, if anyone does take this on, if you can just kind of add a comment on this issue saying that you're going to try and work on item 1 or 2, this is a pretty big issue, so no need to try and take everything on at once, but just if you want to reserve a bullet point for yourself, just add a comment there.
Sounds
and
good.
We won't get duplicated work. Yeah, awesome. All right, well, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week. Thanks again to Harry for saving me from my technical difficulties. And yeah, have a good rest of your week.
Cheers.
See you.